me unmute you. We'll do a quick check.
Okay. Oh, there you go. Hello, test, 1, 2, 3, test, hi. Hello, hello, test, 1, 2, 3, test, hi. Thank you. Cool. So, there.
Check, check, 1, 2. Check, check.
you to lower the bar for me. I know I'm superwoman, I know I'm strong, I know I've got this 'cause I've had it all along. I'm phenomenal, and I'm enough. I don't need you to tell me who to be. Can someone just hold me? Don't fix me, don't try to change a thing. Can someone
Testing 1, 2.
I live my day as if it was the last. Live my day as if there was no past. Doing it all night, all summer. Doing it the way I wanna. Yeah, I'ma dance my heart out till the dawn. But I won't be done when morning comes. Doing it all night, all summer. Gonna spend it like no other. Now I found another crush. A lush life giving me a rush. Had one chance to make me blush. Second time is one too late. Now I found another crush. The lush life giving me a rush. Had one chance to make me blush. Second time is one too late. Don't think about it, just move your body. Listen to the music, sing oh eh, oh. Just move those left feet, go ahead, get crazy. Anyone can do it, sing oh eh, oh. Show the world you got that fire. Feel the rhythm getting louder. Show the room what you can do. Prove to them you got the moves. Hey, I don't know about you, but I feel better when I'm dancing. Yeah, yeah. Better when I'm dancing. Yeah, yeah. And we can do this together. I bet you feel better when you're dancing. Yeah, when you finally let go and you say that solo, 'cause you listen to that music, sing it oh, eh, oh. 'Cause you're confident, babe, yeah, and you make your hips sway. We knew that you could do it, sing oh, eh, oh. Show the world you got that fire, baby. Feel the rhythm getting louder. Show the room what you can do. Prove to them you got the moves. Hey, I don't know about you, but I feel better when I'm dancing. Yeah, yeah. Better when I'm dancing. Yeah, yeah. And we can do this together.
Good afternoon. Our program will begin shortly. Please make your way to your seats and remember to silence your phones, please.
I feel better when I'm dancing. I'm better when I'm dancing. Hey, oh yeah. I feel better when I'm dancing. Yeah, yeah. Better when I'm dancing. Yeah, yeah. Don't you know we can do this together? Bet you feel better when you're dancing. Yeah, I feel better when I'm dancing. I'm better when I'm dancing. Hey, feel better when I'm yeah, yeah.
Before you came into my life, everything was black and white. Now all I see is color, like a rainbow in the sky. So tell me your love will never fade, that I won't see no clouds of gray. 'Cause I don't want another. You bring color to my life, baby. Life was so heavy, I was giving up, no, no. But since you came along, I'm light as a feather. Ah, you give me something incredible, sensational, baby. When we're together, everything is better. My darling, only you can brighten up my day. You make everything change, you rearrange the
Good afternoon. Thank you, and welcome back to the final closing session of the ASC 2022 at the South San Francisco Conference Center. Please find your way to your seats, and friendly reminder to silence your cell phones. Our program will begin momentarily. Let's welcome back to the stage Frank Kilcommons.
Hello everyone, welcome back. For our closing keynote, I'm delighted to introduce Daniela Bernardi. Daniela is the Head of Developer Advocacy and Community at Twitter, and Daniela will share with us how specifications are enabling Twitter's V2 API platform and helping them re-enter the developer ecosystem with a strong commitment to openness and developer experience. So please welcome Daniela to the stage, everyone.
Thanks, Frank. Hi. Twitter and developers have gone a long way together. Today, I'm here to tell you about the journey that's next and how the spec is going to take us there. I'm Daniele. I have the pleasure of running advocacy and community for the Twitter developer platform at Twitter. And I'd like to tell you the story about the spec and Twitter. So we're talking about the journey, so it's time to probably get a starting point of this journey. How about we start from the very beginning? The year was 2006, and we just released the Twitter API v1, our first version of the public API. Well, I say public API, but those are actually were our API, so they were the exact same API that we used to build our own service. What happened there was that at the time the service was a text-based service, only 140 characters. That was it. Developers started to really understand the potential of our limitation. Like nobody could upload images, so somebody, a developer, started to create a way through the API to tweet links to images. Fast forward a few years, that became our media upload service. We acquired that developer, and it became that. Search functionality, same. What happened was this pattern of innovation that was very useful to accelerate the roadmap of the service. That was the probably starting point for us to double down on our developer platform and API offering with v1.1, where we started to really expand and match as much as possible the functionality that we had in the service. The year was 2012 there. And we started to see a lot more offering from our side and obviously a lot more growing pain, if you will, internally when it comes to really talking about the development of the API itself and the governance and the design. Few more things happened. We started to add the ads API. We strengthened our media upload API in offering of 2006. A few functionalities actually were built on the product first, and then they needed to be added to the API. Mind you, we are about here probably 2014, and we're still on v1.1. So how do we manage breaking changes? How do we manage communication? In 2015, yet another acquisition. This is very meta. It was a company who built a developer platform to create enterprise strength API that will allow you to have access to the full archive of public tweets that ever existed. The company got acquired, and that became our new foundation of the Twitter API. Then Periscope came and went, and in 2017, we built this thing called the Premium API, which was basically built a little bit on the foundation of Enterprise API, sprinkled with v1.1 on top. That's where we hit pause. At this point, we have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different API platforms, different offerings. What's going on? Are we even talking to ourselves internally? In v1.1, we had the word for liking something was called favorite. Favorite was the verb for liking a tweet. There were, in v1.1, 2 different spellings, the British English spelling and the American English spelling. So that made us wonder a little bit, are we doing things right? And so the answer was clearly, we need to restart. How about, instead of having all this thing, we just have one unified platform. Developers don't really have to be taxed or penalized for being successful. They start on V11, they become mildly successful, so they get a little bit more access through the premium API, but then they need to change their integration. They become extremely successful, they switch to the enterprise API, yet another integration change, different endpoint. No, let's do one thing. One single thing, one single design. And so in 2018, beginning of 2019, we started with this platform called Labs. Labs was our first ever attempt to do something that we really never tried, to build in the open and to be coherent and consistent. We started to share our design in the open with the public, and that led to V2, which is our now new public API, which we launched back in November 2021. So all this, 2022, today, we thankfully deprecated V1, but V1 is still there. And developers still have to do this journey. And as they go through this journey, as they travel all this API and offering, they start asking one obvious question: how do I know what's right for me? But they also start to ask more deeper questions, like, how do I know if Twitter is on my side? How do I know if Twitter is working for my goals? Are they back for good? Are they really open and free and modern? And so we needed really to solve for one huge problem, the problem of trust. So trust, you can give many definitions to trust. To us, started to really become one single thing, like, showing, not telling, and making sure that people understand where our intentions are. We started to build in the open, but when we start building in the open, what does it really mean? When we talk about being transparent, what does it really mean? I think the first step would have been to really, in this handshake, be the first to do that move. And that would mean, maybe at the very basic, show them what is current, show it what is coherent. In other words, maybe we should start having almost like a contract between ourselves and developers. What's there is there, it's very well codified, it's not just the docs, it's how we operate. And so when we started to think about contracts and specifications, we started to also match the two words together, specification, contract. That's usually how you get introduced to a spec. And so it became natural to us to start working on implementing the OpenAPI spec. Our approach was really to solve for a good developer experience first, but then we also had, as I mentioned before, a design and governance issue that we needed to fix. Like, we needed teams to be really agreeing on the same nouns and the same design and the same patterns out there. We adopted this, developer customer-centric aspect that really helped us a lot internally, and the glue of all this was the spec. This is one example. How do we know if Eng is working on an API change? Well, as you witnessed before, we did not much before. And my org, developer relations, is outside of experience. So we don't have this one-on-one day-to-day communication. We're not really, sometimes brought into all the changes, and we don't have to. But sometimes things change, and we need to document things, and we need to reach out to developers and tell them, look, this new thing has happened. Go use it. It's super cool. So one way we actually started to do this was that, like you would expect from a company like ours, our code is in source. That's obviously, the spec is no exception. Every time Eng changes something that hits the OpenAPI spec, we can just subscribe to their email notifications, and somebody from my team can go to the engineering manager or product manager and tell them, oh, looks like you're working on something. Do you need any help? How can I help you? Can I help you document? Can I help you beta test? Can I help you be successful in your design and release? That fixed a ton of issues already, helped us represent the end customer, the developer, much more efficiently than before. But also had good implications on the overall workflow. And now we have a structure that, all in all, looks like this. Putting the OpenAPI spec at the core, at the hub of all this. When Twitter ships code that touches the public API, then it has to touch the OpenAPI spec as well. Trust. There's an automation. The same automation that triggers those email notifications could be used to generate some artifacts, or can be used to just by our team to start automating some of the tasks like docs and tooling that then hit the public users of the API. And so this also unlocked a wide range of opportunities to make the developer journey more efficient and frankly better even internally for us. So I have a couple of stories about that because I think the hidden gem here, the hidden secret of the spec and the best weapon is not just in the internal workflow improvements or the design or the architectural level, but it's also in the developer experience. And I think that's one of the most powerful things that the OpenAPI spec can do for that. So the first example I have is when we need to prototype. If you need to ship something that hits a customer, you better talk to that customer first before you make a huge mistake. APIs are no exception. We should talk to developers before we do that. We haven't done that consistently up until this whole workflow existed. And the case was really because we are so busy rebuilding the foundation, and we have so many platforms that we had to cater to that we really didn't have an infrastructure to really ship something to beta testers or partners or a specific percent of the entire developer platform population. So how do we prototype? How do we user test in a way that can make developers confident that we're doing the right thing? Because, mind you, with all that and all those changes that happen within our own developer platform as well, we also face the problem that a beta tester can come to us and something in the mock of the user prototype that we built wouldn't work. For example, they would pass a parameter, then parameter wouldn't do anything to the response. That would trigger a question like, oh, looks like that I requested the creation date of a tweet field, but it wasn't returned by the mock response. Are you planning on deprecating that? I need that. That's not good. And we wanted to avoid that. So we wanted to have something that could allow us to use actual public data within a controlled environment with something that would mimic the design and behavior of what we had in mind. But we had zero infrastructure to do that. So how do we do that? Turns out we have one piece of infrastructure. It's the V11 API. Turns out we have a ton of public infrastructure, like the OpenAPI spec could be made public, and there are a ton of tools that can help you do that. So here's what we did. To test out endpoints, we started obviously with designing a mock spec, a design spec. That would just be the design of the endpoint we had in mind. So we would define the request parameters, the response, what was in the body, what was allowed, what was not, the set of endpoints that we were trying to test out. Then we fed that spec into Postman. Postman acted as the front end for the beta testers. So in the spec, you have a base URL and a route. Joined together will look like something like this: api.twitter.com/user/me/followers, if you wanted to get the list of people that are following you. In reality, that's a mock URL. That URL doesn't exist in production. So Postman has this great functionality of creating a script. And the script we used was to basically convert the mock URL that didn't exist. It would return a 404 in production with a URL to a backend on a public instance on this service called Glitch. Glitch is basically a rapid application development tool. It allows you to just spawn maybe a Node.js instance if you want it, and to serve it to a few users. It's great also for sample code. So we also fed the same OpenAPI spec into the controller logic, added an OpenAPI validator NPM package, and that will give us the validation of the input from the client. So in that case, if in the case that I mentioned before, the beta tester would pass a parameter that wouldn't do anything, they would receive an error instead, or they would have the right validation and get the data if that was the case. That glitch controller also did one more thing. They would get the actual URL, the actual request, and convert it into a v11 API URL. It would call the API, get the response, which would look like just an array of strings looking like an ID. And then, with the same OpenAPI spec, with the design we put there, use the schema for that object and render the actual object. And that was the data that the user will receive in the Postman client. And they could do all the sorts of transformation. They could add, remove fields, and they would just basically add and remove things from the payload they would receive from the v11 API. That worked great because it helped us validate the design we had in mind for the endpoints we tested out through this, but also things that were impossible before. This took us weeks to put together for the first endpoint, and then we reused the scaffolding for this. So all we had to do was to change the spec for the next endpoint, and that took us hours. So we were able to go from design to beta testing in literally hours. It works great when you have something like a migration. You have to, you have a data source, you have something that existed in the past, and now you have to do it in the new platform. What if you have nothing to begin with? Can you still use the OpenAPI spec? Can you still use design like this? Turns out the answer is yes. And this next story is a story about feedback. This was for us the case back in 2021, last summer. We wanted to build an API for Twitter Spaces. If you're not familiar with Twitter Spaces, it's our live audio tool. It allows you to have live conversations with anybody on Twitter. It's getting huge traction, and it was at the time. We had a lot more competitors back then, but none of them wanted to build a public API. And there was a ton of developer appetite for that. So we thought that if we were the first to release a public API, we could do the same thing as back in 2006, where developers will lend our creative energies to really inform the roadmap of the main product instead. So we were going really, API first to really to understand what this new communication medium would unlock for everybody. Like nobody knew where Spaces was about to go, or live audio, because it was new. It was like reinventing the radio on the internet in a way. So we didn't know either. And we might have been biased even if we had ideas. So we needed to validate that with developers. And so we thought we needed to do the only thing was reasonable to do. We take it to Spaces. So we open our own Spaces from Twitter, and we went every Thursday on the air. And we just met developers. Thankfully, Twitter has a huge developer community, and they are extremely engaged. I'm sure I met some of you on Twitter as well. And so we just went and asked them two things. What are your goals with Spaces? And how do you know if your goals are met? And we started to gather product requirements to inform our design. I remember in particular this conversation I had with this developer. She told us that the discovery for Spaces was at the time basically non-existent. The only way to get, in 2021, the only way to understand if somebody was speaking in a space was to look carefully at their profile picture. If it was surrounded by a purple outline, that it meant that person was speaking. But that wouldn't tell you what language the person was speaking, what was the topic, and would you even care? And she said, I'm noticing that Spaces are about communities, and sometimes communities speak the same language. Could you please add any kind of metadata in your API that can return any kind of sorts of language information so I can create an experience that can sort popular spaces by language, and that could be useful for people in the same community to find what's relevant to them. We thought it was a great idea. We took it back and started to add that as a requirement. We checked what was available in the back end, and after a week, we released this. A mock API spec. This is in Redocly with their default theme. It looked exactly like this, and it would explain what the design was. Obviously, this didn't exist in production, but something magical happened here. Developers started to just create mock servers from there and see what the data from this spec was. Give us more feedback a few weeks after, and we improved up until a certain point when we hardened the design so much so that we didn't receive any meaningful feedback. So we told them, okay, looks like this is good. Is this good? Yes. So developers validated the design. And this was pretty much like very consistent spec. So we had many minor changes even in our design spec as we got that consistent feedback from developers. So it was time to launch at that point. And the magical thing that happened was that less than 24 hours later, we saw this. What is this? This is the search engine that developer created. And this was the fastest developer integration we witnessed in years. It was 18 hours after we released the API. And so we went to her and we asked her, how did you do it? And she told us, I just used a mock server, and as soon as you released the API, I just switched the base URL from my mock server with api.word.com, and it worked. And by the way, this is the language tag she requested, and it comes from the API. So that's for feedback, and that's how I'm here to tell you that the OpenAPI spec is, can work greatly for design when you have teams and within your own organization, but also to build in the open to do something that's meaningful for developers out there, for your actual API consumers. And obviously, speaking of them, feedback is one, but tooling is also an interesting aspect. And the OpenAPI community is blessed with a great tool chain. SDKs obviously come to mind here. We actually started to build our own first-party SDKs for Java and TypeScript, JavaScript. Believe it or not, up until this moment, we didn't have any. And the community built their own. They wanted to just go a little bit more forward than just making raw requests through their favorite HTTP client. And so there's community of academics who rely on R or Python, and so they want to have tooling specific to them. They build them from scratch on their own. And so we wanted to show them that by using the OpenAPI spec, they can actually start building things like this. This also helped us make our docs more consistent. So right now, if you go on our docs, every single API has a section like this where you can just copy paste. And then if you're using TypeScript, for example, you just add our package as an NPM package, and you should be good to go with this. This helps, obviously, but it still doesn't go the way we want it to. We wanted, with the OpenAPI spec, really go and do the next step, from mock servers, from making actual requests, and from tooling. We asked ourselves, is there anything we can do to actually give developers that sense, that feeling that the V2 API is really different from the rest of our offerings so far? So easy to use that you don't even have to touch any line of code. And we're here talking about code, or the OpenAPI is code. So how do we convert this code to nothing? And so we did what we usually do in Silicon Valley, do crazy things, and we went to a store, specifically to a fitting room. Why a fitting room? What's the purpose of a fitting room? It's to make you feel confident that what you're about to buy actually fits you, to make you feel good that this is for you, this works, this makes you feel good about what you have to do with that garment. So we adopted the same approach here. We went and understood what is the equivalent of trying something before you can actually implement it, And so we came out with this idea of the playground. Something that allows you, similar to the example of the prototype, trying something that's live without actually having to invest your energy. We discovered through user research that migration is an important moment in this. So when you are approaching a new API and you're coming from an old mindset, there's really this first impression that sticks. And as a developer platform, you have to do whatever it takes to make sure that you make a good first impression. That's all that counts. And so with Playground, we actually did that. We created this. It looks like an API console. You can actually try it out right now if you go on t.co/try-API. It presents itself like this, and it allows you to just discover the API. I told you it's like an API console, but it's powered by the OpenAPI spec on the back end. So on the top bar, you can just type, and there's fuzzy search for all the operations that are covered in our OpenAPI spec. I think we are probably now covering 65 plus endpoints at this point. All the IDs and parameters are obviously, covered as well. And what we do, if a field is in enum or has a predetermined set of values, you can just tap on the text box and you have a drop down with the parameters. So in this case, this user had a tweet ID, wanted to understand the author ID, which we don't return by default, clicks run, and sees the live results. The other great thing is that we don't have to update this, obviously. The OpenAPI spec is public, and it feeds out of the production OpenAPI spec. So again, the single source of truth, being very open and transparent. What's out there, it's out there, and you can use it right now as a developer. So net, 0 lines of code for the user to use V2. They don't even have to sign up for the API. They just have to have a Twitter account. And 0 lines of code for us to update. Huge savings. We can invest our energies to do something even bigger, which we can't because we are a small team. And my team is 7 people. And we had to go and conquer the world, the millions of developers out there. We're a global, worldwide developer platform after all. So how do we do it with just 7 people? Maybe we create a bot on Twitter. So I want to introduce you my newest member of the team. It's called V2 Endpoint of the Day. It's on Twitter. And every day, tweets out an endpoint from the Twitter API to V2, powered by the OpenAPI spec, actually powered by the same code base that powers the playground. And so the other day, it tweeted its favorite endpoint, look up by username. It's also one of my favorite. You can just specify user by the username. Do you want to try it now? Tap on the link. You go back to Playground. It's already filled out with a username. You just have to hit run, and it goes. So this is exactly the type of next steps that any organization can take by just starting with a single design, a single spec. And to us, this has proven incredibly, incredibly beneficial to really impress, amaze, inspire, and do all the kind of outreach that a global developer platform like ours has to do, specifically with the next step of the journey ahead. And also, to restore trust, to make a platform not just used, but also loved. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, so well done. You made it to the end. So thanks very much, Daniela. That was really, really good, really inspiring. So that's pretty much a wrap from us. I just want to say thank you again to our event sponsors who are out there, who make events like this possible. A big thank you on my behalf to the program and the planning committee. Thank you for all of your time, all of your input to make this event really a great success. I'd just like to call out Celia for a special thanks down there. Really, really good. And I suppose for me, and I think Daniela touched on it, and so did some of the other keynotes, I think community is so important to what we're doing here. Listening as well, so listening to the consumers. So we're all invested in building APIs, but making sure we put the consumer of that experience front and center. And even just me personally listening, going around listening to all of the conversations, I think there was just as much goodness happening out there in the little mini conversations that were happening than were happening in the breakout sessions. And I think it shows that we're trying to break down the barriers of the open API community. We're trying to make it more inclusive. We're trying to get better feedback and even evolve beyond the specification itself for the greater good of the API industry. And it's great to see the different vendors who have, of course, vested interests are having really fruitful conversations as to how we can drive things forward for the benefit of the people who are actually using the specification. So for me, that was a real privilege to experience that firsthand, and I thank you all for participating in that, and I wish you all a safe trip back to wherever you may be going from here. So thanks very, very much.
I love all y'all, but I love me the most. I don't mean to brag, I don't mean to boast. I love all y'all,
But I love me.